Building our log cabin on Mount Seymour in 1948. The actual construction began in 1948 when Bill Johnstone and Ross Regan, the narrator of this story, had secured a building permit by payment of $20 and the submission of a building plan to the Lands and Forest Department of the BC government. After graduation from high school, Bill and I decided to build a log cabin on Mount Seymour in the Goldie Lake area, where cabin permits became available. We hiked up the mountain and found the site number 135 for our cabin permit and met three fellows, Bill Dawson, Greg Prothman, and Gordy Clark, who had a permit to build nearby. The other active participant was my brother Roy Turner, who was 6 years younger and went to build his own cabin in 1950. None of us had any experience at building log cabins, so we decided to join forces and build one cabin in 1948 and another one in 1949. In those days, no legal document was necessary, and we all relied on a simple handshake to secure the agreement. All plans and ideas were shared to complete the project, and this was a major undertaking to build two cabins in the forests. Since there was no road up Mount Seymour, this venture involved getting all the necessary equipment organized and then packing it on our backs up the trail to the cabin site. There was no public transportation, so everyone started from the base of the mountain at an area called the Mushroom Parking Lot and hiked up the Buck Trail over an area called the Burn, where there had been a fire years before. The hike from the base to the cabin took at least 2 hours and was much harder than the popular grouse grind of current times. Each person carried a packboard of supplies that weighed between 100 to 150 pounds, and some made 2 or 3 trips in a day. All food and clothing and cooking utensils, plus lumber, hammers, saws, axes, peavies, cables, winches, all had to be carried up the trail to the cabin areas. Many others had undertaken cabin building before us, so the other mountaineers were very helpful in offering help and advice. We accepted the invitation of Ken West, Gordy Love, and Ken Long to use their cabin over the summer while we were building our own. At times we stayed at the overnight lodge, which was operated by Harold Inquest Sr., who was the real pioneer of Mount Seymour. The exact location selected for the corner post was on a small side hill to ensure that the front of the cabin would be high off the ground to allow for the heavy snow depths in the winter. This shows the size of a yellow cedar tree that was to be used as part of the foundation. Bill Dawson and Roy Turner started the task of falling this huge tree with an axe and crosscut saw, but the work of falling a huge tree made us realize that we faced an immense job. Next shows Gordy Clark on a springboard, ready to make the undercut for falling another tree. We all agreed that we needed a chainsaw to fall the trees that would be needed for all the logs to build our cabin. Chainsaws were not in common use at that time, but the next weekend we rented one for $5. Next weekend we decided to cut all the trees in one day and save the cost of renting the chainsaw again. The result of this decision was that the trees were piled on top of one another in every direction with the branches still on. Before the mess could be sorted out, the ranger, Ole Johansson, came by and was very, very upset at this jumble of trees on the ground. He assumed that we had cut more trees than required for this cabin and proceeded to lecture us on the waste of trees. We assured him that all of the trees would be needed for our logs and promised to abide by the rules in the future. Months later, all of the logs were used to complete the cabin construction. Chopping all the branches and skinning the bark off the logs was the hardest work that any of us had ever undertaken. We learned to keep the axes sharp and became good at using long crosscut saw, to which took a great deal of cooperation between each participant. This work was even more complicated by the presence of millions of bugs that the people called no-see-ums, and sometimes large horseflies that gave a nasty bite. The bugs were a major problem as they got into your eyes, ears, nose, and even your mouth. We tried every kind of bug spray and deodorant, but nothing worked. Some of the crew tried smoking cigarettes just to discourage the bugs, but to no avail. Netting around the hats helped a little, but this made it more difficult to see and thus became a danger while working with axes and saws. At times the bugs became so bad that we had to take a break from the clouds that clustered around the site. To lift the logs into place, we acquired a hand winch and built a boom with a cable extending from the winch to a block and tackle. This picture shows Bill Dawson using a climbing spurs and safety belt to climb a tree and rig the cable from a boom to raise and lower the logs. Next picture shows Greg Prothman working on a boom to secure the block and tackle for lifting logs. The physical labor of using a hand winch to attach a chain and cable to each log that had to be lifted and lowered was tiring, but all took turns at this backbreaker. Moving the logs on the ground was accomplished with a peavey which had a large hook on a hinge to roll the logs into position. When the foundation logs were in place on top of the foundation posts, the next step was to decide how to make the corner notches. Some people were using V notches or square notches, which were easier to cut, but we decided that saddle notches would be the best because there were no gaps in the corners. Each log had to be carved on a curved shape so that one log was fitting tightly over the next with no space showing around the corners. This required very skilled axe work and the use of a large metal scribing tool to mark the exact shape of the next log. This picture shows Ross Regan, Bill Johnson, and Bill Dawson resting on the foundation log and planning the next move. Picture shows Ross Regan and Bill Dawson using a crosscut saw to level the top of the foundation posts. Next picture is Ross and Greg moving the next log into place with the guidance of someone above us. The chain really had a cable attached and the logs are hidden. Ross and Gord are cutting the next log in picture 8 because before it is moved into place. Each log had to be raised up and scribed for cutting the exact shape of the notch and then lowered to the ground for cutting the log. Using the hand winch to raise and lower each log was very hard work, but we decided that it was much safer than attempting to use axes and saws on top of the construction. This picture shows Ross and Bill scribing the line for cutting a saddle notch on the next log. Then the next picture is Greg and Bill Johnson examining the first saddle notches after using the PVs to place the log in position. Number 11 shows the boom pole with block and tackle that was used to raise and lower logs. Number 12 shows the log in position to be scribed before the notches are cut. Then it was lowered to the ground for cutting and raised again to be fitted into position. This picture shows Bill Johnson with pencil in his teeth ready to mark the lines on the next log. Other cabin builders gave us advice on the need to secure each log in place by drilling a 2-inch diameter hole through one log and halfway through the log below for a large wooden dowel to be fitted so that logs would not shift. Drilling such a large hole by hand seemed a lot of work, so we determined to find an alternative method. By experimentation, we found that it was possible to drive a steel rod 1/2 inch in diameter into the log with a sledgehammer. The steel rod had to be cut to the right length and square on both ends so that it would pass through one log and go halfway through the next one. When this unique idea was tried, it worked fine, as long as the person wielding the sledgehammer was accurate in hitting the steel rod. Then we had to pack all the steel rods up the trail on our backs. Needless to say, this caused much laughter with the other cabin owners who assured us that it would never work. But it did work, and we saved many hours compared to drilling holes and carving dowels by hand. Hauling everything that was needed for building the cabin, including our tools, lumber, food, and sleeping gear, was a long and tedious process hiking up the trail. At night, hikers used various methods for carrying a light to see the trail ahead. The most common was a bug light, which consisted of a large tin can on its side with holes punched into the bottom. A string was used to carry the can, with a candle placed inside to shed light on the trail. Some people simply used a flashlight, while others had a carbide lamp, which was the best light. This lamp was a container of carbide and water that generated a noxious gas that could be lit, and as the gas was allowed to escape, it showed a best light. They were stinky and often had to be cleaned, but the light was bright for hiking and carrying our large packs. It was quite a sight to see dozens of hikers with their lights wending their way through the trail in total darkness. There was still no regular transportation system, and often we had to use private vehicles to get the materials up to the start of the old Buck Trail. On one particular day, there was a chap with an army jeep parked in the lot. After some discussion, he bragged that he could haul our stuff up the trail in the jeep. We negotiated a price of $10 and then loaded up the jeep with a huge amount of materials. Some of us ran behind to give him a push when he got stuck. We had tied ropes onto the jeep to trail behind so that we could keep up as he charged up the trail. This wild method got our materials as far as the existing parking lot near the old ranger station, and from there we loaded our packbacks on to hike into Goldie Lake. Around this time we had found an old Canada Pride cooking stove, and that would be perfect for the kitchen in our cabin. The challenge was to get this huge stove from Vancouver over to Mount Seymour and up to the cabin. By using the jeep, we planned to get the stove up the trail to the parking lot, and with everybody heaving and pushing, the task was accomplished. There was still the distance from the ranger station to the cabin at Goldie Lake. Since the Canada Pride stove weighed 450 pounds, we used some 2x6 boards and strapped them to each side of the stove. With someone on each corner, it was possible to carry the stove. To lighten the load a little, we took off all the cast iron plates on the top of the stove, but it was not until we reached the cabin site that we found that Gordy Love had placed all of the loose plates for the top and put them in the oven. Anyway, as soon as the logs for the kitchen were finished, we used the winch to lift this huge stove up in the air to its final resting place in the kitchen. The stove gave us great comfort with much heat, and all meals were prepared on this old wood burner. Years later, the stove was converted to burn oil, and this saved cutting wood in the park area. That was the last trip with the old Jeep, because the forest ranger said that we were damaging the trail. We contended that the metal cleats on the half-track that the forestry people were using to transport their materials cut the trail more than we were doing with the Jeep. In those days, there was no way to win an argument with the forestry people, so we went back to carrying our supplies on our backs. This shows Gordy act as a balance to keep the log level, and the next shows Ross using an axe to cut another saddle notch. Next picture is attaching the chain and cable to the next log, and 17 shows this crosscut saw to cut the notch before finishing the curve shape with an axe. It shows the saddle notches at either end of the log being guided into position. Ordinary hiking boots were always used to avoid any marks from cork boots that the loggers used to obtain a better grip on logs. Next, Bill and Greg scribing lines for the next notch to be cut. In the front view, with a foundation log on a stump that is 10 feet off the ground. Next picture is Ross fitting the next log into position. The next one is showing Bill and Greg scribing lines on the next log to be cut. This picture shows the log in position to scribe lines for the next notch. And this shows the saddle notches in one corner and how tightly the notches were made. Picture 25 is a decision time to select the next log and ensure that all corners were being kept level. This shows Greg marking the lines for the next notch, and Bill is supervising the operation. This shows Roy and Ross taking rest as they admire the progress. Next picture is the progress to date, and we're halfway there. Shows the porch and kitchen with the boom pole behind the cabin. This picture shows another view of the kitchen and porch area, two areas that became one in the end. This shows the workers just taking rest, with Bill, Ross, Gordy, and Bill resting and posing. Next picture shows Ross and Bill Dawson and Bill Johnson and Greg with all of the logs in place. Next is showing the basic shape complete and ready to start on the roof. Ends of the logs have not yet been cut. This picture shows the last log in the ridgepole with a happy crew hanging on the top. Window openings have been cut for the main room and the kitchen areas. This picture shows the front view. Materials for the roof and siding were cut from cedar shakes, but the problem was to find old cedar logs big enough for shakes. We found a couple of logs near Goldie Lake and cut them into lengths required for our roof and siding. Shakes were split by using what they called a froe and a wooden mallet to split the dry cedar into planks, so they were about 1/2 inch thick. These shakes were then carried on our backs back to the cabin and used on the roof and siding. Next picture shows the roof covered and the front walls of the kitchen are finished. This picture is a side view of Ross sitting beside the finished cabin. From the ground there is a ladder leading to a trapdoor in the floor of the kitchen. In the summer, we entered by the ladder, and when the snow came, we entered by the front door. And if there was a really big fall of snow, then we came in through the upstairs window into the sleeping area. This shows the happy crew in the upstairs window. God's Little Acre is now finished. Food for all the weekends of hard work was usually purchased in Vancouver at the old Woodward's food floor. There was no limit to the variety and quantity of food to feed the hungry crew each weekend. Everyone took turns at cooking and washing up. At times the gang would head into Vancouver for a big meal at the Empire Cafe, which was located on Hastings Street near Cambie. This shows the happy crew from left to right. Mark Johnson, Greg Prothman, Ross Regan, Roy Turner, Bill Dawson, Bill Johnstone, Ken West, Ken Long, and Gordy Love. With winter approaching, the task of insulating the cabin was important. Oakum was used to stuff into every crack and crevice to keep the draft out. This was a tedious task, but one that everybody took part in at times. Each person would take strands of oakum and use a stick and hammer to force this insulating material between the logs and corners of the kitchen. At some time during the summer of 1948, we decided that the cabin and crew should have a name to identify the location. Author Erskine Caldwell had written a book about a chap who bought some land and was always digging holes looking for gold. The book was called God's Little Acre. So we decided this was a good name for our cabin because the place was very special to us. During the winter season, one of the ladies thought that this crew from Goldie Lake were rather foolish in their antics, and so she said we were acting like horses' asses. Bill Dawson thought this was a good identity marker for our crowd, so we had an artist draw a picture of a horse's ass on skis, with the name God's Little Acre around the edge of the circle. This insignia became our badge for our group, and we all wore it proudly on ski slopes anywhere we went. Over the following years, the picture shows a ski crest for God's Little Acre worn by our group at Goldie Lake. Since there was no regular transportation available, to the base of Mount Seymour for the winter, we contacted Ed Neville, who ran buses around Burnaby Municipality, as Neville Transportation. He agreed that we'd take one of his buses from downtown Vancouver to the base of Mount Seymour on Friday nights and do the return trip on Sunday nights. He would meet us at Eric Lorillard's ski shop on Cambie Street and load up all manner of supplies in the bus and on top of the bus for the trip to the base of the trail at Mount Seymour. This picture shows winter snow that covered the cabin. There were times that 5 feet of snow fell during the week before we came back on the next weekend. People struggled with their supplies and skis to make trail up the snow and made it to the Goldie Lake area every weekend. On leaving each Sunday, some brave skiers would even ski down the Old Buck Trail, which became rather icy from all the hikers. There were no lifts or tows for us to use for skiing in those days, so we used different devices to make it easier to walk up to Mystery Lake or the top of Brockton for a run down to the bottom near the old ranger station. Sealskins were attached to the skis for climbing, while other people cut rings from old inner tubes and wrapped these around their skis to prevent them from sliding backwards as they walked up the hills. Some skiers simply carried their skis, while others climbed herringbone style. Most old hickory skis had no steel edges in those days. Ski harnesses were also rather primitive, with coiled springs that went around the heel and fastened to the front of the ski to keep your foot in the ski. Good skiers used long thongs, which went through a hole in the ski and then wrapped around the ski boot. These had the same effect as bear traps, which had metal toe pieces to hold the ski boot onto the ski. There was no way for your boot to release from the ski if you fell, so it was much better to learn how to ski. Many of the Goldie Lake group took lessons from Gus Johnson, shown in the next picture, who was also a special friend to most skiers on the mountain. This era was the beginning of the safety harnesses that allowed your ski to release from your foot in a fall, but these devices were crude compared to the superb models in use today. Ski runs were seldom packed, so some skiers adopted the telemark style in the deep snow. Others simply pointed their skis straight down in a chute and hoped for a smooth landing. Ski clothes were bulky and baggy, and picture Ross shows the old ski clothes from that era. They were baggy and heavier than most modern ski clothes today. Some people could afford to have their ski clothes tailor-made by Joe Wall at Alpine Sportswear on Pender Street in Vancouver. People did not make a big deal out of clothes, since the main purpose was just to have fun in the outdoors. After all the hard work during the day building the cabin, there was time for fun in the evenings over the whole year. Dances were held in the old lodge owned by Harold Inquest Sr., and many parties were held at various cabins on the mountain. The picture shows a Halloween costume party held in 1949. Dances were held at Sadie Hawkins Day from the Little Abner comic strip cartoon, or for any other special event that came along. Alcoholic drinks were part of the fun, but there were no drugs, no pot, or any of the substances of modern times. Everyone was out to have a good time and make new friends. There were times that Goldie Lake froze over from the snows, and Goslingler group went ice skating using the lanterns for lights. Many people came to visit at the Goldie Lake cabins, and evenings were spent talking about skiing, skiing techniques, waxes, ski harnesses, design, cabins construction, skiing at areas of Sun Valley, ski racing, and the road that was needed, or any other topic. There was no limit to the topics of discussion and no limit to the fun and adventure of the early days. Since no lifts had been built on Mount Seymour, many of us drove to Mount Baker or Stevens Pass, both in Washington State, and we all dreamed about skiing in the more developed mountain areas such as Sun Valley. Our cabins were seldom locked, so others could stay overnight in any emergency situation, but break-ins or thefts were rare. Some cabin owners had found bears had entered and made a real problem inside a cabin, but the Goldie Lake area never had this kind of problem. By 1949, efforts were made by Sam Taylor and the Mount Seymour Ski Club to convince the Liberal Conservative coalition government to build a road up Mount Seymour. Many trips were made over to Victoria to make the case to Mr. E.T. Kenny, who was Minister of Lands, and he finally agreed to have government finance this undertaking. Road construction began in earnest, and the contractors were unable to restrict cabin builders from making their way up the trails to build the cabins. People always found another route through the bush to get to their cabin sites, and at times it was dangerous. When we heard the sound of 3 long blasts of a whistle, this meant that a charge of dynamite was to go off in the vicinity, so people had to scurry for cover behind any trees. No one was ever hurt, and cabin construction was ongoing during the time required for building the road. Our group at Goldie Lake was busy with the construction of the next cabin, and there was only the weekends of the summer months for the job. Our group now had our own means of transportation, and we used different equipment methods. We had purchased a power saw, and we used a power winch with an engine to lift and lower the logs instead of the hand method of the previous summer. It was still hard work, but the tasks seemed to go faster with our prior experience and power equipment. We had also purchased a small power generator that could now boast that our first cabin had electric lights instead of candles and lanterns. Next picture is a view of the top of Bracton looking out over the north arm of Burrard Inlet. Scenes like this attracted many more people up the mountains of the North Shore. In the early years, there was a friendly atmosphere where most people in the mountain knew each other and shared the same outdoor interests. These early days of pioneers brought people of common outdoor interest together and created many long-lasting friendships. The building of the road brought many changes as more people were able to access the outdoor life on Mount Seymour. Skiers were now able to drive up to the existing parking lot, but the amount of snow that blocked the new road still created problems in the winter. The Highways Administration had placed a counter cord across the road to record the number of cars that were using the road. So we decided that if more cars were using the road, then they would keep it plowed more often after snow fell. So every time we drove up the new road, everyone got out and jumped up and down on this counter cord to register that a higher number of cars had passed used the road. There was no way to tell if this stunt influenced the road crew or administration to keep the road plowed, but it did exercise our legs for skiing. Cars often had to use chains due to the amount of snow that fell in those early days. With the road also came demand for rope tows and chairlifts, and more people drove up to play in the snow. Parking was limited at the top as the crowds of people found that Mount Seymour was an easy drive from Vancouver. God's Little Acres survived the heavy snows in the 1960s, and when the logs began to deteriorate and the roof was beyond repair, by this time Mount Seymour was administered by the Parks branch of the government, and they were not happy with all the cabins that had been built under the prior rules and regulations for the mountain. Cabin owners still maintained their sites under the annual agreement, since none of us owned the land. Cabins could not be rebuilt, so as each cabin became unusable, it was burned to the ground. There was no sign of God's Little Acre had ever existed. But the memories of the activities and the fun times lingered on. Ross Regan, Bill Johnson, Greg Prothman, and Bill Dawson and Gordy Clark, Ken West, Ken Long, Gordy Love, and Roy Turner had great times as some of the pioneers on Mount Seymour. There have been reunions held by Roy Turner at Sorrento, BC, as shown in the last picture, with over 55 people attending this event. Bud Black also holds annual gatherings of the old-timers. Hollyburn Heritage Society and Mount Seymour History have alternating events each year in the summer for skiers and cabin builders to share stories like this one. Over 60 to 70 years have passed since these pioneers opened Mount Seymour for the crowds of today to enjoy the beauty of nature.
Okay, this is the beginning of Mount Seymour Provincial Park, where the original people started building cabins long way back, 1930s. And we started in 1948. With no road up here at all. But this is the provincial park that has come to pass as a result of all of the efforts of many people before us. These are some of the trees that we cut to build cabins. But the modern day people do not like the idea of cutting trees this size. These are finished trails today, but the trails that we had to hike on were very primitive and rugged. It makes it easier for people to enjoy the park now because all the trails have been kept to a high standard of hiking. This is the current trail now. But when we hiked up through here, there had been a huge fire, and all these trees did not exist in the area where we were hiking. This is what they called the Old Buck Trail, and it was a very primitive and lacking of trees and old growth. So it's now developed and more people can enjoy it, and lots of good trees standing. And this is the present beginning of the Old Buck Trail. And our sites were a long way up the mountain from here. And we built these cabins to go skiing. And it took a long walk from this point all the way up these trails to get to the Goldie Lake area where we built some of the cabins. It's hard to conceive how difficult the hike would be carrying a backpack of materials of 100 pounds or more to carry all the materials up to the place where we built the cabins on Goldie Lake, near Goldie Lake. At the start, and this goes all the way up here, and we built cabins in the Goldie Lake area, in this area. This is the present parking lot for the skiers and hikers to park their cars today. But all these are trails that people can hike and explore.